In 1920s America, business disagreements over market share rarely ended in a lawsuit. They ended in a shootout. The 18th Amendment sparked a 21% rise in Chicago's homicide rate as pre-existing gangs moved beyond gambling and brothels to fight over the massive illegal liquor trade. Controlling a massive chunk of that market was Al Capone. As the boss of the Chicago outfit, Capone cultivated a public image of a respectable businessman, complete with tailored suits and a charming smile. His main rival was George "Bugs" Moran, the volatile leader of the North Side Gang. Moran was known for his intense stare and his explosive temper, and he had already tried to assassinate several of Capone's closest mentors. The two bosses maintained a fragile truce until a dispute over old log cabin whiskey. Moran started undercutting Capone's prices to steal customers. Capone retaliated by cutting off Moran's supply entirely, so Moran responded by violently hijacking shipments from Detroit's Purple Gang. What started as a negotiation over wholesale liquor pricing rapidly devolved. The truce collapsed, pulling both syndicates into a violent, zero-sum struggle for dominance over the city. On the morning of February 14, 1929, 7 of Moran's top enforcers gathered inside a freezing garage at 2122 North Clark Street. They had been lured there by a phone call promising a heavily discounted truckload of hijacked whiskey. Moran himself was supposed to be there to inspect the shipment, but he was running slightly late. As he finally approached the address, he saw what looked like a police car pulling up to the garage doors. Assuming his crew was being raided by local cops, Moran ducked into a nearby coffee shop to wait it out. But the men stepping out of that vehicle were not Chicago police officers. They were heavily armed hitmen, disguised in stolen uniforms. By mistaking an assassination squad for a routine police bust, Moran unwittingly walked away from a trap designed specifically to kill him. Inside the garage, the disguise worked perfectly as a psychological weapon. Believing they were simply being arrested, the 7 North Side Gang members willingly handed over their guns and lined up against the cold brick wall. The execution began immediately. The fake officers opened fire with 2 Thompson submachine guns, unleashing 70 rounds. The shooters swept their weapons in a precise, methodical pattern, targeting the men at the head, chest, and stomach. To guarantee there were no survivors, the killers stepped forward and delivered a final strike at close range, using a sawed-off shotgun. The hitmen then walked out the front door, staging a fake arrest. The 2 men in plainclothes raised their hands, while the uniformed killers marched them out at gunpoint. To any neighbors startled by the noise, it simply looked like the police had the situation under control. Meanwhile, Al Capone was 1,000 miles away. He was spending the winter on a Florida beach, surrounded by witnesses, establishing a perfect legal alibi. By weaponizing the authority of law enforcement, Capone's syndicate executed a mass assassination while keeping their boss legally untouchable. When the real police arrived, the sheer horror of the crime quickly spilled out into the snow. The public was terrified by the realization that brutal executions were now being carried out by men dressed as the very people meant to protect them. Hiding out in a nearby hospital, Bugs Moran immediately understood who had orchestrated the slaughter. He told the press, "Only Capone kills like that." The irony of the operation was that Capone's squad completely missed their actual target. But the sheer volume of the casualties effectively wiped out the North Side Gang's operational muscle anyway. They failed to kill Moran, but the massacre effectively granted Capone a monopoly over Chicago's illegal liquor trade. Up until that morning, many Americans had viewed bootleggers as romantic rebels supplying a thirsty public. But lining 7 men against a wall and tearing them apart with machine gun fire crossed a hard line. The resulting public outrage pushed the federal government to draft the 1934 National Firearms Act. This legislation regulated civilian access to automatic weapons by slapping a $200 tax on every machine gun, effectively doubling the cost of a Tommy gun. Federal law enforcement also realized they needed a new playbook. Unable to directly link Capone to the murders, they shifted their focus, pursuing his operation through intense financial audits. Eventually, the most violent crime boss in America was taken down by accountants. In a federal courtroom, Capone was convicted and imprisoned, not for murder, but for income tax evasion. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre wiped out Capone's rivals, but the resulting public blowback armed the federal government with the legal tools they needed to finally topple him and end the era of the untouchable Chicago mob boss.